Good morning. I'm Kaylynn Myers, if you don't know me. This is the third time I've stood up during the sermon part of the service that wasn't to walk out of someone else's, so I'm a little nervous. Thank you to the elders for the opportunity to share with you this morning, and to Jeff for leaving town. For inviting me to sub in for him this morning. We will have a review of the Salvation series in Bible class today to go over everything we've been learning. If you were hoping to get to watch a video of N.T. Wright this morning, you'll have to come back next week. But we will hear a story this morning about salvation. The actor and director Kenneth Branagh has made several films over the last few years that are new adaptations of Agatha Christie stories. He remade Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, and he cast himself as Hercule Poirot, her iconic mystery detective. In the last one, A Haunting in Venice, we follow Poirot to the famous Italian city of canals to investigate a murder. Part of his investigation finds him in attendance at a seance led by a mysterious woman who has shown up with two young helpers, a brother and sister, who we later learn have been making a living helping her put on an act. When Poirot confronts them, they admit that they are charlatans and thieves, but not murderers. Their village burned, they've survived refugee camps, and their desperate, true longing is to make it to the United States and finally get to Missouri. They'd been hiding in the forest, living on weeds and mice, when the Americans showed up, gave them blankets and tins of food, and showed them the first half of Meet Me in St. Louis on a film projector every night for a month. The brother says, "St. Louis, Missouri, just saying those words could get my sister to fall asleep." So it turns out A Haunting in Venice is a comedy. No, actually, it's a dream come true to be in St. Louis. We moved here 3 years ago from Boulder, Colorado, before which we were in Kunming, China for 5 years. My grandparents were members of McKnight Road Church of Christ for several decades, and I attended here many times on weekend trips to exotic, glorious St. Louis. The family story goes that on one of those weekends, as a 3 or 4-year-old girl holding hands with my mom and Oma in the parking lot, I declared, "Isn't this fun here at Grant's Farm?" I went to graduate school in Texas. That's where Travis and I met. The summer before we met, I was an intern for a friend of mine who was a youth minister in Melbourne, Florida. The teens and I took a lot of trips to the beach, and I planned a scavenger hunt. You can go to the next slide. I planned a scavenger hunt around town that only one teen showed up for. But I was also tasked with planning our Sunday night Bible studies. I wondered what would get these kids to show up. What could we study that they hadn't heard 100 times? I decided to dig into the Old Testament for stories that I thought were kind of weird or gross or surprising that perhaps they hadn't heard before. Like when Ehud stabbed the fat king of Moab, and the whole sword sank into his enormous belly, from Judges chapter 3. Or when Jael lured the commander of Canaan's army into her tent and then hammered a tent peg through his skull while he slept, from Judges chapter 4. I called the series Tales from the Crypt, which seemed adequate to me for getting their attention and drawing them in. But the crypt was also the place where Christians would hide to meet together in secret in times and places where that was needed. And I imagined those Christians entertaining and teaching each other with all kinds of tales from the Old Testament that they could use for inspiration and encouragement. Today we're looking not at Judges 3 or 4, but at Judges chapter 6, which is the story of Gideon. His tale is much longer than Ehud's or Jael's, but is worth looking at for inspiration and encouragement, as well as for the aspects that are weird or gross or surprising. When I told people I was going to preach about Gideon, I got some interesting reactions. Larry Franke asked me if I was going to talk about the Gideons, the group whose approach to the American frontier was to place Bibles in hotels, which first took place in 1908 at the Superior Hotel in western Montana. Barb Eichel alluded to the origin of the English idiom of putting out a fleece as a test to determine if something is in line with God's will. Ben Maringer, I think it was Ben, brought up how Gideon's army was divided according to whether they lapped up water with their tongues like a dog or knelt down to drink. I would encourage you to go read the story of Gideon in its entirety this week in Judges chapters 6 through 8, because there are many fascinating details that we won't have time to hit all of this morning. But this is a story about salvation. So let's review. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God breathed life into the dust of the ground and formed human beings into the image of God, and he gave them a job to do. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Grow into a large family and tend the land. I've made this beautiful world for you to inhabit, and I'm entrusting you with its care, and you will be my people, and I will be your God, and dwell in your midst, and it will be very good. It turns out that people have a hard time with very good. They fail to listen to God and fulfill the intention that God had for them, and everything goes wrong. So God sets his sights on a particular man and makes a covenant with Abraham to help him build a special family and inhabit a special land, a land of milk and honey. Even better than St. Louis, if you can imagine, which I think is the land of frozen custard and gooey butter cake. Through Abraham's family, God has a plan to ultimately bless all nations, but Abraham and his family take matters into their own hands and eventually end up enslaved in Egypt. God hears them and raises up Moses to deliver the people from Pharaoh. God delivers them out of Egypt with a mighty hand, but Moses and the people who were rescued out of Egypt fail to trust God, and they die in the wilderness. Only later do their descendants inherit the land that was promised to their ancestors. Joshua, whose name means Yahweh is salvation, led the people into the land of promise, driving out its inhabitants. He assigned to each tribe its inheritance and reestablished the covenant before he died, imploring the people, as you'll remember, to choose this day whom you will serve. As long as Joshua lived, Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. But the first line of the book of Judges is, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up to fight against the Canaanites?" You can throw up the Judges 1:1 verse. So gung-ho they are at first, ready again to take matters into their own hands. But the people of Israel need more help than they know. They need saving. The Hebrew word rendered save, also translated as deliver, is found more times in the book of Judges than in the first 5 books of the Bible combined. Judges is all about salvation, but it's about the hard lesson that ultimately each time God raises up a deliverer for them, it doesn't lead to a lasting deliverance. The book of Judges is a descending spiral, a pattern that with each new judge that the Lord raises up to deliver Israel, after a while they forget the Lord, fall away from God's purpose for them, to be image bearers, to show the world what God's really like, and instead they fall into fear that they must satisfy the gods of the nations who dwell around them. The recurring refrain of Judges is, Israel again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Each new deliverer anticipates the deepening need for the Lord to raise up a new Joshua, one who can put a permanent end to this madness. So now as we work through the Judges cycle and come to the story of Gideon, it will soon become clear that while some aspects of his story are impressive, this is no Joshua. The Israelites' enemies, or you might call them neighbors, were once driven from the land, but they're back. The presence of the Midianites in the land is not merely oppressive, it's invasive. The Israelites are carving out a literal niche for themselves in which to eke out a living, while the people of Midian and their camels swarm over everything the people of Israel have worked to grow. In chapter 6, verses 7 through 10, it says, "When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians. And I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the God of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me.'" Now, I like to think I've learned something from listening to Jeff Kreider's sermons. So let's pull a Jeff and look at all the verbs that God uses to describe his salvation of the Israelites up to this point. God brought them up out of Egypt, rescued them, delivered them, drove out their oppressors, gave them the land, and spoke to them a divine injunction. In this passage, anyway, there seems to be one thing God expects from the people in return: to listen. But they fail in this. They've worshiped other gods, and now they are in desperate trouble. When we meet Gideon, he is threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. Now, I don't know a whole lot about how a wine press worked in the ancient Near East, but I know two things. A wine press is not a threshing floor, and if a wine press is empty in order to thresh wheat in it, then it's not full of grapes. Perhaps there was no grape harvest. Perhaps Gideon had such a small amount of wheat to process that using the threshing floor would have seemed laughable. But in any case, he would have been too exposed there, so he was hiding, doing what little small batch specialty milling he was able to do. Suddenly, the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." So it turns out that the angel of the Lord is a comedian. I wonder if it was the angel Gabriel that the Lord sent to Gideon here, because something about this feels awfully familiar. It reminds me of the Annunciation when Gabriel appeared to Mary in Luke chapter 1 and says to her, "Greetings, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you." And it says she was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. I like to think of Gideon as an artisan. He doesn't strike me as the warrior type. And I don't think he sees himself as a warrior either, because he has a few follow-up questions about this greeting. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." After this exchange, Gideon springs into action, asking for the first of several signs that he will request in order to verify this transaction. "Stay until I prepare an offering and bring it out to you," he says to the angel. Then, like Abraham, when he entertained the 3 guests at his tent, Gideon goes into host mode. He makes the world's largest French dip sandwich with flatbread made from an industrial bag of flour, a whole goat, and a pot of broth, enough for a small army. When we lived in China, several of our friends had birthdays in October around the same time as Travis. One year, we all went out to the outskirts of the city to a village and shared a roast goat that was prepared in front of us. Here's Ruby in front of the goat. As you can see, it more than fed the group of us for a birthday feast with leftovers. Anyway, Gideon presents this offering to the angel of the Lord, who has him lay it out on a rock and pour the liquid all over it. Then the angel taps it with his staff, and fire comes blazing out of the rock and consumes it all. It reminds me of what God does for Elijah with the prophets of Baal, having jars of water poured all over the sacrifice before setting it ablaze. So the angel thought, that was fun, let's do another one. For this one, the angel of the Lord has Gideon disassemble the community altar to Baal that his father had put up, cut down the wooden Asherah pole that had been erected beside it, and reassemble the stones into an altar to Yahweh, using the wood from the pole as fuel for the fire. Gideon does all this, albeit at night, since he is not quite ready for a fight with the townspeople. He's not quite ready for a fight of any sort. Though if you'd like him to construct a lovely monument to Shalom and call it Jehovah is Peace, he's your guy. God, however, is ready for a fight. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon, and before he knows what's happening, our peace-loving, handy artisan, hardly warrior is sounding the call to arms, summoning the nearby tribes to prepare for battle, gathering more than 30,000 troops for war. Only Gideon would still like some extra reassurance that God is the one guiding this plan. Gideon, in verse 36, Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. He must not have expected it to work because Gideon is astonished. And then he says, strike that, reverse it. And of course, we know God does it again the opposite way. We've seen Gideon threshing wheat, baking bread, arranging a sacrifice, laying out the fleece. I think Gideon is a kinesthetic learner. He knows what he can touch. And God knows how to work with him. God will continue to use that trait of Gideon's as the story unfolds. The next day at the camp, God says to Gideon, "You have too many men. Send home the ones who are scared." And so he thins it out by 2/3. And then God says, no, we can do better than that. I'll thin them out for you. And so they head down to the water for a drink. Now, I've thought about this, and I cannot figure out any substantive difference between lapping up water from cupped hands, like a dog, as it says, and kneeling down to drink. I've heard others claim a significance to the reasoning for why God used the way they drank their water to choose who to keep. But I suspect it was just a convenient way to narrow it down to less than 1% of what Gideon had started with. Maybe those who lapped with their tongues would have strong tongues for blowing trumpets. So now, famously, Gideon's army is down to 300, and they hunker down for the night. In the middle of the night, God says to Gideon, "If you're scared to attack, take your servant Purah and sneak into the Midianite camp to eavesdrop on what they're saying about you." And here's what they overheard. Next slide. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Well, hearing the dream about the wheel of bread tumble into camp has Gideon convinced. He wakes up the 300, let's call them soldiers, divides them into 3 companies, and arms them with trumpets and empty jars with torches inside. "God is giving them into your hands," he says, as he arms them with implements of sound and light. The text could not be more clear. What they did not have in their hands were swords. It says the 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The Midianites wake up surrounded by a host sounding 300 trumpets, wielding the light of 300 torches, and get up and turn on each other. For all they knew, each one of those trumpeters was backed by 100 bad guys with swords. No wonder when the host of angels appeared to the shepherds watching their flocks by night in Luke chapter 2, they had to tell the shepherds not to be afraid. If my kids threw on all the lights and started playing Hallelujah chorus in the middle of the night, I'd be reaching for the nearest weapon too. They chased them out of the valley and across the Jordan River. And here's where Gideon's story gets weird and sad and much less familiar. Gideon ends up in a petty argument with the people of Succoth, who refuse to provide bread to his troops who are worn out from chasing the Midianites all night. He vows to return and teach them a lesson by tearing down their tower and whipping them with thorns. He kills 2 of their kings of Midian, but only after he's shamed into doing it because his own son is too afraid. The Israelites want to make Gideon their king, and he sounds so valiant when he refuses. He says, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And then Gideon says just one thing. "If each of you could bring me a gold earring from the plunder of war, and let's collect them." And so they collect all these gold earrings, which end up weighing more than that industrial bag of flour that he used to bake his offering. And Gideon goes back into artisan mode once more. Only this time, he constructs the earrings into a gold ephod. I don't know if this means that he sees himself as a priest or an expert diviner of God's will, but all the Israelites go and worship it at Gideon's hometown and make it into a new idol. In Hebrews chapter 11, it says that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see, and that this is what the ancients were commended for. It lists heroes of the faith from Abel to Noah to Abraham to Rahab, who modeled faith for us in various ways. And then it says, starting in verse 32, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies." When we look at these stories of faith in the Old Testament that the New Testament writers commend to us, maybe instead of tales from the crypt, it should be stories from the cloud, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. According to the writer of Hebrews, despite Gideon's cowardice, despite his failings and ultimate inability to inaugurate a lasting salvation, Gideon has a place in that great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us. He's cheering us on in our race to God's good end. And if opportunity affords me the chance to preach from this pulpit again, I intend to look at more of these stories of faith from the cloud. Thank you.